Hey there, it's time for the show, the Tatiana Show, where you make friends and talk life and crypto. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Tatiana Show. Josh isn't with me today, but I do have Lieutenant Diane Goldstein from the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, known as LEAP, formerly known as Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. They've really expanded their mission. I've been aware of this organization because of my involvement with Ross Ulbricht and Lynn Ulbricht's mission to get him out of his double life sentence plus 40 years for all nonviolent crimes. And that's when I became familiar with the effects of the drug war. In the larger conversation today, the day that we're taping, we have the announcement of the charges being brought against the officers involved in the killing of Breonna Taylor. And it brings up a lot of different questions about overall what's going on with the police in this country. We've had a lot of riots all around the nation. We've had some deaths. And I really wanted to get a little bit more insight. So I'm very, very appreciative that you could make it today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. We really appreciate the ability to come on and have this very nuanced and complex discussion.
Yeah, that seems to be, the first thing, right? Everybody says, oh, I hate cops or I love cops. And I think that it's really somewhere in between. We've been hearing a lot about defunding the police. But I think it would be apropos if you could maybe give us a little bit of background as to how you became a police officer and how you got involved with the organization.
Sure. So I spent a career in law enforcement from 1983 to 2004. I grew up in Redondo Beach, Torrance, California, and I did my policing in the city of Redondo Beach, but I did multi-agency, jurisdictional type of work, everything ranging from gangs to career criminals in the investigation of narcotics offenses, as well as having a variety of many different types of assignments that were operational in nature. I retired as a lieutenant in 2004, and when I retired, I was a division commander, so I was responsible for patrol, traffic, community-based policing, as well as a bunch of collateral assignments, which included crisis negotiations team and peer counseling. So I have kind of this real big, broad view of law enforcement, which brings me to how I got to LEAP. I'm currently the chair of Law Enforcement Action Partnership. I've been with LEAP for the last 10 years, starting in 2010, when I attended a debate on marijuana legalization in California on Proposition 19. And I had always felt in my law enforcement career, both from a personal and professional experience, that the one area where we had really failed was the enforcement of our drug laws. I have a brother who passed from a polydrug overdose back in 2007. He suffered from mental health issues, bipolar, manic, clinically depressed and self-medicated, and had been criminalized, quite frankly, from the time he was a kid almost to an adult, with long periods of being able to function in his life and maintaining his sobriety. But when he lost his health insurance and access to his psychotropic drugs, he started self-medicating again. So I bring my views on reform and policing reform from many different levels. And really, ultimately, the goal is, I think, that, we can, as a society, wish and hope to create better policy that's more inclusive of all our communities. I'm not certain we're at the point where we're going to be able to abolish the police yet, even though I think that there's places, and there's a ton of them, that law enforcement has just been asked to do too much. And so we need to start reallocating resources that prevent law enforcement contact with the community in many aspects, and then work towards a more just criminal justice system that includes ending the drug war, it is changing our use of force policies. I mean, there's a whole gamut list of things that we should be doing that we're not.
Okay, that's a great intro. Thank you. There's a ton of questions that I have to go down the line. Would you say that there's a problem with police brutality in the United States? And would you say that that's a racially motivated issue?
I think it's complex, and it's not necessarily one or the other. I think the problem is many. Yes, let's be very clear. We have people in law enforcement that are racist and that abuse the power that they've been given. That's very clear. But I've also worked with a tremendous amount of police officers in many agencies who don't understand how systems of policing were set up that created not just policing systems, but let's say financial systems, redlining, insurance. I mean, there's a whole host of things that have contributed to systemic and institutional racism that has resulted in where we're at right now.
Okay. Do you think that there's a certain aspect of that that's supported by the police unions? I mean, what's causing that? Because a lot of people say defund the police, and then you have police unions that are sort of fighting back against that. I mean, where's the line there?
Um, the it's a very interesting issue right now. I think that in many aspects on both sides of the equation, people are yelling over each other. But let's be clear, is we have some real vocal police unions that very specifically, I see like Philadelphia, the New York police unions, the Sergeants Benevolent Association, the PBA, and several other fraternal orders of policing organizations that engage in using dog whistles, quite frankly, that are clearly racist in nature. And so, that I've written about this issues where, you have police unions that call people in their communities that they're supposed to serve thugs and that they should be, shot. It's completely inappropriate behavior. And I'm never going to support that type of union. There's a proper role in place for police unions if they were limited, like other unions are, to things such as working conditions and financial issues. But the problem right now is politicians, city managers, government officials understand and curry the favor of police unions for political endorsements. And that, frankly, has to end. And again, we start talking about the complicated nature of politics is, we have Citizens United that allows law enforcement unions and associations to contribute to political races that, frankly, for me, I think should not be allowed. So how do we eliminate that without, impeding on people's constitutional rights? But I think that we have to start calling out law enforcement. One of the big mantras, Tatiana, for years has been from law enforcement is we don't make the law, we just enforce it. And that's, quite frankly, that's a lie. In my work in policy reform, my work, as a career law enforcement official, is law enforcement lobby has contributed millions of dollars to oppose politicians who support reform or to oppose legislative reform in all our capitals, state, local, and at the federal level. And I don't think that should be allowed. I think that law enforcement has a role like the military does, that we're the only two actors that are allowed to kill people. The military in engaging and protecting our borders, and law enforcement here. And if you wield a gun, you should not have the ability to help create laws.
I agree. What do you think is one of the biggest things that is causing this lack of incentives? I would say that one of the things that really shocked me was civil asset forfeiture, for example, and funding police departments through civil asset forfeiture. And I think that really ties into the drug war. Can you speak to a little bit how the drug war and these kinds of incentives create more opportunities for clashes with the police?
Oh, absolutely. Let's start with, I think, the history of drug criminalization. They're from a philosophical standpoint. I really believe that law enforcement should not be involved in morality policing. And if we look at the history of law enforcement going back to August Vollmer, who was a highly respected police chief back in the early 1900s during alcohol prohibition, Berkeley has named their criminology department after him. He professionalized law enforcement in many aspects, as he believed back then that law enforcement should not be involved in morality policing, gambling, sex work, drugs, alcohol prohibition. And he believed that if we did, that it would create corruption within law enforcement. And it has very, very clearly. And so the modern day drug war has incentivized police departments really through forms of bribery that emanated out of the federal government. You have burn jag grants that go to local and state law enforcement that are based on, drug task forces, or the reimbursement of overtime in certain cases, or the sharing of assets through civil asset forfeiture reform. And they're not based on really the metrics that we should be using, which is the absence of crime and community satisfaction. It's based on the number of arrests, and it's churning people through the criminal justice system that has done nothing to stop drugs from coming into our country or stopping kids from using drugs.
So you have a lot of drugs being used in Wall Street, right? All those guys are just partying all day and doing all sorts of drugs. But it seems like the poor neighborhoods are oftentimes targeted. There seems to be a history of that in the United States. Can you speak a little bit about why, Main Street and not Wall Street?
Sure, and I think a lot of it has to do with, and that's what props up systemic and institutional racism, is why are we not treating Wall Street in the same fashion that we're treating communities of color? And so when you start looking at our drug laws in particular, and this is history that's not taught to law enforcement. When you go in the academy, no one teaches you about the institutional issues relative to policing, how we started out as slave patrols in many places, how that portion of policing has really had a significant impact on how we are viewed in communities of color. But then you start looking at how we criminalize certain behavior. We criminalized opium because of the Chinese. We criminalized cocaine because of Black people. We criminalized marijuana because of Mexicans. It was done simply based on racism back in historically, early 1900s. And that's just continued to permeate our society. If you start looking at how, the opioid addiction issue that we've been struggling with the last couple of years, is if you look at how the media views that white football player in high school who got addicted to prescribed opioids versus how they view a Black kid in a urban area, it's night and day. There's research that shows the distinctive difference in the words used to describe them. One is described as a victim, the other is described as a criminal. And so until we in the criminal justice system and society in general understands that, things aren't necessarily going to change. I think we're starting to see change. I think people are starting to finally see it. And this year is a clear example, the death of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, really has pushed our society into having to look inwardly and say, we got a problem, and how are we going to deal with this?
So people talk about defunding the police, and there's apparently in neighborhoods of color a big mistrust of police. Snitches get stitches. But it's posited that if you defunded the police, those communities would be hurt the most. What do you do about something like that? Because it seems very ingrained to not like cops. And therefore, I think people are probably a little bit more aggravated when interacting with the police officer because that's sort of been culturally learned. Is there a way around that? And is defunding the police an actual option right now?
I don't like to use the term defunding the police, but I understand where that comes from. I understand why there's a lack of legitimacy relative to the entire criminal justice system. We've seen it because of corruption, because we wouldn't have an Innocence Project if law enforcement and prosecutors didn't railroad people. Okay. And so the only way to gain people's trust is by changing the very nature of policing. And again, the complicated issues is, let's start by reallocating resources. And let's all agree that our society has, instead of front loading the system, they backloaded it and dumped socioeconomic issues on law enforcement that we're incapable of handling. Period, simple, end of story. It's not going to happen. And so we have to start looking at how we scale up and refund the community with those resources that descales the footprint of law enforcement and makes everyone safer, including the cops. And I think that's the issue right now. It is, there's fear on both sides. And no one is, well, I shouldn't say that. There's a lot of very, very smart people we're working with. There's a lot of great community activist groups and organizations that are doing exactly those things. I don't think we as in a society should be afraid of the hashtag, or the strategic messaging about defunding the police. It has created a critical time and space where it's making us look at what policing should be about. And can we do it better? Can we reconstruct it? Can we reimagine it to make it into community health and safety, not just public safety?
How can you reallocate those resources if city budgets are dependent on tickets? So you've got lots of cities around the country where the politicians are irresponsible with their budgets. And so they're pressuring police officers saying, oh, give this ticket, give that ticket. And they're essentially fleecing these communities that can barely afford it because some guy at the top, wanted to spend a little bit extra and there's just no accountability. I feel like that makes it almost an impossible situation because what's the city supposed to do if they can't make the money from the police officers, which is bad for the police officers because now they have to become the enforcers of, they're tax collectors essentially.
Well, we shouldn't make police officers tax collectors. And that's the problem. And you're right. And, I would suggest that there's groups and organizations that are already starting to figure this out at a local level. And it's about how you address the budgeting issues. And it's complex. People are talking about defunding the police, but no one is actually doing it at this point because it's complicated, because you start talking about budgeting and procurement and exactly where are these fiscal resources going to be coming from. And so I've seen organizations in places like the city of Los Angeles, and I think it was North Carolina, I can't remember what city, who organized themselves at this very grassroots level to sit there and work with their local politicians about how a budget should look in a community that's involved and to determine how they're going to be policed. And so, I think it was Durham, North Carolina. I could be wrong, but it's one of the cities in North Carolina did this very successfully. And that budget hasn't necessarily been implemented, but it's in the process of being implemented. And so when we start looking at solutions, there's a lot of solutions that are evidence-based right now that work. So for example, Eugene, Oregon has a program called Cahoots. And it basically diverts law enforcement from going out to calls where someone is struggling with mental health issues. You have a mental health provider, and I think it may be a paramedic, but it's funded at the level. They have a van, and they've taken, I think it's something like 30% of these calls away from law enforcement. They're more efficient, they're more effective. People aren't going to jail. They're scaling up to the resources that they need to do, and ultimately making law enforcement more efficient by allowing them to concentrate on calls that police maybe should be handling: violence, rapes, those types of calls. And so, we have to look at and again, we have to hold our local politicians and city governments accountable for their budgets. I believe budgets are a moral document and should be reflective of what that particular community wants and prioritizes. And if they don't believe the cops should be handing out tickets for running red lights, law enforcement should be reacting to the priorities that the community has designed, not the other way around.
I would think that would be very hard to implement. I mean, there are so many laws that are on the books right now. How do you reverse them? And you've got judges that have their money inside jails, so the whole financial interaction of the drug war and the policing system and the prison system is so tied together. I don't know how people can disentangle that, because I mean, our whole country it feels lately like everything's just falling apart and it's so corrupt. I've never seen politicians say, you know what, you're right, you should keep your tax dollars. We're totally going to cut back our budget and we're going to let these people out of prison. I mean, you're not really, I've never even seen that really happen. So it seems like a nice idea, but it seems so difficult to implement.
Oh, and it is difficult to implement, and it's not a short-term issue. All the academics that I know that are working in this field, and the research that I'm reading, is people are talking about that this is going to be a 10-year process. And so you have to have people that are willing to commit to these programs. It's not just about, with mental health. It's about how do we fund appropriate mental health resources? How do we, ensure that people have good schools? It's incredibly complicated and made even worse by the issues of COVID-19 right now. It's every state is basically looking for federal bailout on tax dollars, and it's going to be a process. But I think that if we look at taking small bites of the apple and implementing model policies in a particular city, and that's again the importance about voting. It's again the importance about being involved at the local level and having your voices heard, because you have to make local change. At the same time, there's other changes being had at the state level or at the federal level. And, all of us, I think, hoped for some type of federal reform of policing after George Floyd, but it became political. And so really, it's also about how do we completely change our entire political system to be more responsive to us, the constituents, instead of political parties holding us hostage to their own particular political agenda.
Yeah, I think that's a really hard one to crack, because I mean, it seems like a lot of corporations have a lot of money and they can incentivize the politicians. You can look at what your politician choices are right now. I mean, right? It's not exactly like you're choosing between Mr. Fabulous and Mr. Fabulous 2. It's usually not a very good selection. Um, you talked about COVID a little bit. Wouldn't the mask policing be another reason why police and communities will clash? That seems a little bit difficult to all of a sudden expect police to be stopping people because they're not wearing masks, but not just police, even store owners, all of a sudden they're expected to be the police of the masking. I mean, is that going to go on forever? Because that sounds like it's just going to be a problem.
So, other countries have handled the mask issue. I saw the greatest video. Police officer in a subway, I believe it was Madrid. Guy's driving up, basically walking up, doesn't have a mask. The police officer didn't slam him to the ground, didn't stop him, handed him a mask. Guy put it on and went his merry way. Our response here is creating laws, giving law enforcement more power to enforce that type of mandate and statute. And instead of us just handing people masks, we try to force them to wear a mask, and it's not going to work. Now, to your point about store owners, I think store owners have every right to refuse people entry. It's their store. It's private property. There's no constitutionally protected right to walk into any shop in America or any restaurant and not have to obey their rules. Whether we like it or not, it's like, go someplace else then.
Well, some people would argue that they have a medical exemption and the store wouldn't be able to ask about the medical exemption.
Yes, they can. Under the ADA is they can basically ask them. The person is not discriminated against under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Plain, simple, end of story. And I think that's part of the issue, part of the problem. My mom lives with me. She's 80 years old, and we had to be really concerned with keeping her away from places. And I guess here's the thing, and this is the difficult part about America, because we're such firm believers in liberty and that our personal liberty trumps kind of the collective. And I'm like very much, as I've gotten older, I'm much more libertarian, but I also believe I have a responsibility towards others. And so, every videotape I've seen of the masked people, they're white, entitled, and privileged. And so I just, I'd like to be more sympathetic towards them, but they're creating false federal cards. They're trying to bully and intimidate people. And I just...
Isn't that freedom of expression? I mean, to put a mask over your face if you don't feel that that's helping you, it seems like that's a violation of the First Amendment.
It's not, but it's not.
I don't know. The courts might rule differently. I think we'll kind of see about that.
The courts have already ruled.
On masks?
The courts ruled during the Spanish pandemic, the Spanish flu pandemic, that government had the right and stores had the right to ask people to wear masks. It's already been done. That's why there's no lawsuits that have been filed. There's already court precedent that sets it. And if I'm a store owner, I have the right as a store owner to tell people, you're not welcome in my store. And I, as a store owner, if I want people in my store and don't want to and want them to not wear masks, I have that right too. But okay. It doesn't. It's a really hard situation. I'm hoping we're done with this. But I think COVID-19 is changing the nature of not just our country, but the world in general. And we have to create better solutions on how we're going to handle pandemics. I don't think we handled this. And that's been part of the issue. We overregulated in some aspects, we underregulated, and we never found that sweet spot on how to protect people and the economy.
Right. Well, I think we could go on to a 12-hour long mask thing.
What's the point of all this technology without a little love in our lives? Our hosts, Tatiana Moroz, Dr. Stephanie Murphy, and Lauren Kasovitz have come together to bring you Proof of Love. Go to proofoflovecast.com.
So now we've got a lot of different riots going on all around the country, and there's a lot of violence. There's a lot of animosity toward police officers. And you see some police officers, and in a way, I kind of don't blame them. They don't even want to enforce it anymore. They said, you know what, whatever. Sometimes a lot of property is getting damaged and police officers aren't getting involved there. What do you do if the police just basically say, nope, we're not doing this anymore? I mean, what do you do in that situation?
Well, I don't think the cops have not have come to that place. I mean, there was a point in Seattle where they had the Chaz, and eventually the cops came back in when it became too dangerous. Part of the issue with expressions of anger, and a lot of these are legitimate expressions of anger, and that law enforcement has not had the pre-established relationship with communities where when things happen that they're able to work in between big events to sit down and say, how do we successfully allow people to protest, which is their constitutional rights, while protecting people from being hurt or from property being damaged. And, it's really interesting that, so much of the riot stuff that I've been watching, the Antifa, is when I start looking at some of the folks who are causing the most damage, they're not necessarily Black. They're
Well, they seem
white.
like repeat offenders. That's the thing.
Yeah,
they're getting let
white
out
bored
and they're
kids.
starting more problems every time. They seem to keep getting arrested and then they just go out and do it. So it seems a little bit suspicious to me.
Well, you can't keep people locked up indeterminately. So people are allowed bail. You can't hold them forever. Yeah, we're stuck in kind of this vicious circle. But what we also know is, and there's been tons and tons of research on this, is when law enforcement shows up heavily militarized, that also incentivizes violence on the other side. So again, it's about collaborating and establishing relationships before problems happen and before problems exist. That allows, legitimate expressions of anger where people don't get hurt. There's been a lot of peaceful protests that have been hijacked by people. And I think that's, part of the issue is you have bad actors on both sides that are hijacking legitimate protests that should be protected, and it on both sides. There's political rhetoric on both sides. I think that this administration has done a very poor job, and they've caused a lot of these problems by sending in the federal government in Portland, threatening to send in the federal government in other places. There's a lot of overreach from government, and there is a lot of bad actors that I'm seeing that are taking advantage of it.
What would you say about no-knock raids, obviously, and if you could actually explain a little bit what happened with Breonna Taylor's, the police officers responsible for her death. Tell us a little bit about what was up with that decision, and more broadly, do you think that no-knock raids need to be eliminated? I've heard some kind of police officer on a podcast saying that there's actually some benefits to no-knock raids, and you didn't make that compelling of an argument, but it kind of sticks in the back of my mind. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what happened there and what is the larger picture for no-knock raids.
There is no benefit to no-knock raids because there are a variety of different ways that you can execute arrest warrants or search warrants. So part of my background is I helped start a law enforcement association called the California Association of Hostage Negotiators. I spent almost my full entire career doing training and managing and being part of a critical incident response team. And so when you start looking at policing, there's lots of ways to skin a cat. And so what we know in the Breonna Taylor case is this was a marijuana investigation. So let's talk about the failure of our drug policy. Right now, we have 11 legal states for adult consumption. You have like 30 plus states that allow medical marijuana. Why are we investigating marijuana? Why, there's other things we should be doing, because 40 years, we haven't stopped people smoking marijuana. We're not going to stop people smoking marijuana. We could do a better job, just like we did with alcohol, or in some aspects, teen pregnancy or smoking. We could implement public health strategies that are much more effective than criminalizing people for wanting to use drugs in some aspect. So, period, simple, end of story. If we treated drugs as a public health issue, period, and we didn't have narcotics units that were focused on stopping drugs from coming into a community in this fashion, you wouldn't have deaths like Breonna Taylor. I blame her death on the drug war. Secondarily, I blame it on the 40-year history of incentivizing the drug war through grants, through civil asset forfeiture, as we've discussed. But they were after marijuana. You can't flush marijuana down a toilet. So the only reason for no-knocks are to prevent the destruction of evidence or to save lives. What the officers did was reckless. It was a horrible execution of a search warrant. They could have called in on the phone and said, "Hi, this is the police. We have a search warrant. Please come out." We've done that. I've done that a lot. And, 99.9% of the time, people come out. Or if they were afraid that someone was dangerous there, we have surveillance team. You sit out in front of the house until that person comes out, and then you take them down in a safe fashion. No-knock raids basically amplify risk and danger to the community and to the police officers. Now, there was only one police officer that was charged in the Breonna Taylor case. And as I recall, he was the police officer that ran to the back of the apartment and literally just dumped rounds into the apartment that went into the neighbor's rounds. So he violated policy and law, which is why he was indicted. And unfortunately, the grand jury had to deal with facts and the law. And the Kentucky law did not allow for charges against the other two officers because the use of force, according to Kentucky law, was justified to protect themselves once the victim's boyfriend shot his gun off. And so until we change law and policy, we need to start implementing things like no-knock warrants should not be allowed. And if they're allowed, there should be some really strict judicial scrutiny. And I blame this on the jurists who signed the warrant just as much as I blame it on the cops.
Wow. So, what do you think of police cameras? Because a lot of people, of course, want to see police cameras, but I've also heard the argument made that sometimes it gives an incomplete picture, and then all of the people who are watching it now think that they're a jury and they're not necessarily informed of everything, and then you have a very inflamed community. So how do you manage something like that with the police cams?
I think it's incredibly complicated, like all of criminal justice policy. And I think cameras are valuable, but they're imperfect. Very much so, because of exactly that is you don't capture maybe what happened before. Okay. And so, but I think that if we're implementing police cameras, we need to be transparent and accountable to the public. And we need to not hide behind them. And so, when you start looking at how do we prevent things happening from the future, I think one of the things that we don't do well in law enforcement is we don't have sentinel event reviews. So, for example, big train crash, big airplane crash, everybody understands the process. There's a NTSB that comes in and helps in a parallel investigation to determine what went wrong and how to prevent it in the future. We don't do a very good job of that in law enforcement, and we need to do a better job of it. And there are sentinel review teams that could be created at a local level with subject matter experts in constitutional law, use of force, with civilians, to take a look at events such as this, or events like if there was a false conviction. There's a variety of different things that we could implement and view to change the system for the better. And it's not about lack of resources, it's a lack of political will.
What do you think is wrong with police training today? Because people are saying, oh, these police officers aren't properly trained. There's a lot more of a de-escalation methodology, I guess. My co-host, he couldn't make it, but he's from Germany. And he says that in Germany, they really de-escalate it. What's going on with our police officers? Why aren't they getting trained? And what could be done in order to improve that?
You have to completely change academy training. You have to change the training, which is the belief that every single contact you have could result in your death, and that every person you come in contact with is the bad guy. And, it's, yes, you have to be careful. Yeah, I spent a career in law enforcement. I had my share of fights and crashes, and I was involved in a shooting, and I've had guns pointed at me where I didn't shoot at someone. And part of it, I think, for me, was the recognition, because I wasn't 6'6" and 250 pounds, that I had to learn to communicate and de-escalate situations much more so than an officer who is just literally physically bigger than I am. And so academy training needs to be changed. We need to have more of a focus on the professionalism of law enforcement. One of the examples that I use a lot is in California. In order to be a police officer, I think the academy has to be a minimum of 1,650 hours. Roughly, it may have changed, maybe a little bit more now, but to be an esthetician or to cut someone's hair, it's double that. And so you have to start looking at, what are the standards that we're using? What do we want our police officers to do? And because of liability purposes, there's a lot of training on use of force because of the liability, but there's not enough training on communication. And then you have to look at who we hire as police officers. There's some really forward-looking law enforcement agencies who are looking at, recruiting more women. It's been shown that women in policing use less force than men do, and I think a big part of it is because physically we're smaller, and we had to learn how to, communicate, manipulate people into changing their behavior without threatening them or beating them, because you're going to get hurt if that's the only tool that you always use. And so we emphasize the use of a gun, where that should be the last thing we go to. And then it's, how do we recruit people that have people skills and understand that really policing is about serving others. It's not about just catching bad guys. It's about literally working with your community and serving your constituents in the way that they believe is necessary. And so a lot of policing right now isn't about service to others. It's about, and I blame so many different things, including cop shows for this. I hated the shows Cops. I hate, all the sex crime shows and the police shows. I think have been probably one of the biggest disservice to society, because they think that policing is all about that murder investigation, and it's not. Yes, that's a big part of our job, but most of policing is helping people. It's about serving. It's not just about locking people up.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, sometimes you definitely get cops with a bad attitude and you have to wonder, what are you even in this job for? Why do bad cops get to stay? Because that's a really common theme for people, that, the good cops are by nature bad because they don't get the bad cops out and they have a moral responsibility to do so. It seems like there might be some problems in the infrastructure. So how do you resolve something like that? I mean, why are these bad cops getting, paid vacations every time they do something wrong?
Say police union contracts. Frankly, it's police union contracts. And again, it's kind of that vicious circle, because strong police union contract resulted from poor police management. And so, it's always the, what comes first, the chicken or the egg. The police union contracts, no different than teacher union contracts, protect bad employees. And so I have, stories on both sides. I was a school resource officer, and this is a teacher union contract, but I've also had similar occurrences in holding police officers responsible on the police side. So as a school resource officer, we had a teacher who did not allow a student to go to the restroom during class, and the student defecated in his pants. And the parents came to the school, and the school said, look, we want this purely independent investigation. It's not a criminal investigation, but could you handle it for us? And so I did this full independent investigation with all the kids, everything, where the school, the district tried to basically fire the teacher. And the union contract protected him, eventually was forced out and retired. I had a similar situation with a police officer that I ended up helping remove from our surveillance narcotics unit. And then when I was a lieutenant back in patrol, he made some really racist comments about another police officer and several other police officers who came to me and complained. And so I did an internal affairs investigation, and we couldn't fire him because he went out on a medical stress, but we ended up retiring him. But he should have been fired years before. This wasn't his first misconduct. He had a whole history of misconduct, and every time people attempted to hold him accountable, is he was protected by that union contract. So how do we modify and change unions so they understand that sometimes there are places where they just need to say this officer needs to go? Which brings up, how do we decertify police officers? We have the American Bar Association, we have the medical associations that conduct quality investigations into attorneys or doctors who have malpractice issues or who commit crimes, and they decertify them, take their licenses away, punish them. California is one of 5 states in the nation that has no decertification process for police officers. And so we have to do a better job across each each state legislatively to make certain that police officers that commit misconduct aren't allowed to leave a police agency and go to another police agency and work. And that happens across the country.
Yeah, that seems like a very tricky problem because the police unions are really very powerful. And there's a lot of police officers that are, that like the protection that they afford them. Um, to switch gears just a little bit, when is lethal force okay? And why don't they just shoot him in the foot? I mean, that's like a typical thing that people say. Why do they have to unload so many rounds in this one guy? And but at different points, I mean, I think hindsight is 2020, right? At the time, maybe you don't know that they're reaching for their cell phone and you think it's a gun. Um, there's a whole range of different things that can happen when lethal force is implemented. Can you speak to when is an appropriate time versus when isn't?
Well, and again, I think that's very complex because it's based on federal law. There's a case called Graham v. Connor that has basically ruled law enforcement conduct for years that basically says is the use of force must be viewed from the objective, reasonable officer. So then there's the policy issue, and I think that we don't do a good enough job of implementing policy that is foremost based on the sanctity of life. And so, there is no necessarily hard and fast rules that say, we shouldn't be shooting people in the back. That, there's rules against that. But sometimes what happens in situations, and I've seen it, you have a bad guy who has a gun, who is running away, turns around with the gun, the officer shoots when he's facing, but the suspect quickly turns away and then is shot in the back. So you have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. And so training, it's very hard to train people to shoot to wound. That's not how training occurs in law enforcement. That's not how training occurs in the military, which is why we should make the use of a weapon like a gun the very last resort. We have to give officers a significant amount of training and other tools. So that's the last thing they roll to. Let's take a look at the shooting in Kenosha. You had that's going to be, quite frankly, down the road, I predict that that's going to be another one of those awful but lawful shootings, as a potential. But those officers allowed that situation to get out of control. And so, there was a skirmish. Allegedly, the suspect had an officer in a headlock, and so he gets up and walks away. In the car, there's kids. I'm sure they can see the kids. They know who the suspect is. The officer tries to grab him by the back of the shirt with the gun out. That's a horrible tactic. There is nothing else that you can do at that point. You have to really completely recognize that training needs to change so people understand de-escalation. And, sometimes you do allow a suspect to walk away and then you regroup and come back and find them at a different time. In my career, there's been several incidents where we've been called out to situations because someone was threatening suicide and they in fact had a gun, but there's no one else in the house. Or there was a kid that was threatening suicide that was locked in his parents' bathroom. And people are calling us to come save those people from themselves. And in both those cases, myself and several other people made the decision that we don't want to escalate this situation, because if we kick the door with the kid who's got a knife, that's likely going to result in us having to kill him if he points a knife at us. Are we the best people to resolve that issue? And we walked away and we basically told the family, you know what, you need to leave. We're calling the psychiatric team from LA County. They'll be here in 35 minutes to help you with this. And you know what? They talked the kid out of the bathroom and they got him to a mental health hospital. We should be looking at situations like that. On the suicide with the guy with the gun, we walked away. We had a whole SWAT team out there surrounding it, wasn't answering the phone. There was nothing else to do but kick the door to save him from himself. And instead, what we said is, it'd be horrible if he killed himself. But how about if instead we place a couple surveillance units out front? And if he walks out, we're going to stop him and then get him the help he needs. And that's exactly what happened. It's when your first response is to go to a gun and to not think, not to slow down, not to take the time to really do an assessment is when people get hurt.
You mentioned SWAT teams, and I've read a lot of articles by Radley Balco talking about the history of SWAT teams, kind of really originating, I guess, back in the 70s. And it's just every year there's more and more of this going on. You have a lot of military style weapons being given to police officers and police stations, old stuff from different wars and stuff like that. I don't know. Once you give people those kinds of toys, I don't think that they want to give them back. How do you reel it back in from, this basically military police style force?
So let me be clear, is I support the use of SWAT teams in their proper role. And there is no need to have an agency with 15 officers to have a pseudo SWAT team. So again, it's how you take a look at, there are times where a SWAT team is necessary. What are those situations and what are those circumstances? Hostage situations, terrorist situations. There are times where you need a SWAT team. But the problem with SWAT teams that we saw based on the drug war is what happened is that a lot of SWAT teams were implemented, started, and the only way for them to get practice was to do warrant service for narcotics. And so again, it's holding your police agency accountable to, hey, we understand that there's a need for a SWAT team, but does a department of 15 people need one? No, there's a regional perspective. Maybe there should be a regional SWAT team. There should be an elimination of the 1033 program, which is that militarization program that gives certain type of equipment to law enforcement. There should be a better handle on that if we're going to continue it. And there should be, at the ground level, the community should have input into whether or not those types of equipment should be taken and used. Because one of the things that's happened on this 1033 program, what people don't understand when you start talking budgets and stuff is, law enforcement takes it, they sell it to, their government and say it's free, but it's not really free because you have to now update it, service it, and use it. And so there's research that's been done that's been very interesting, is that in agencies that accept the 1033 equipment and have SWAT teams, they're much more likely to have higher use of force incidents, which is no surprising because they're using toys.
I know that we're getting a little bit close to the hour, but I have a couple more questions if you have the time. I've heard that they're banning chokeholds now. Do you think that that's a good thing? Do you sometimes need a chokehold? Why was that in place before? So is it bad to ban them?
It's nuanced and complicated. And there's two separate types of chokeholds. One, was the bar arm that should be banned, and the other one is much more a carotid restraint. And unintended consequences, if you completely bar a carotid restraint that can be used effectively, you are potentially going to increase the use of lethal force. And so, again, it's complicated because one of the things you have to look at is there may be some circumstances, and that's when an officer's life is really in danger or someone else's life is really in danger.
Yeah, that gets a little bit difficult when you've got the sound bites in the news saying, "Oh, this happened and that happened." It really causes a
Yeah.
lot of animosity. Um, there's a lot of corruption in the country. There are, a lot of different CIA black ops that are involved in the drug war. And I've heard it stated that if we ended the drug war, the economy would collapse basically the same day because there's all this weird money funneling around all around the world. What do you think of some that kind of a concept? I mean, if we said tomorrow, no more drug war, that's it. What would happen to the economy?
Yeah, you know what? There's, I think, something like over $300 billion in the illicit market. Like if you look at simply the illicit drug market from a GDP perspective, it is in the billions of dollars. And I think what we're going to see down the road is, yeah, I think there's a potential of, some economic issues related to it, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't stop it. I mean, it's like, because the only people that are profiting are people that, dictators, terrorists, organizations that are victimizing people. And the whole issue of the drugs is the profit. Most of these people don't use their own drugs. They're just profiting off socioeconomic issues, people who are suffering from mental health issues. We have got to start creating public health strategies that may cost us money, leading up to full decriminalization, sensible regulation of drugs down the road. And we have to take that profitability out of it because then we can take the violence out of it as well.
Yeah, well, that's, I think, everybody's hope is to take the violence out.
Mhm.
One final question. What can be done to make good cops more visible? Sometimes you see these kind of silly, corny videos where they're singing together and it's kind
Yeah.
of like pandering. What can cause some genuine change in the relationship between the police and the communities when a lot of times the government are a little bit involved in pitting them against one another?
I think it has to be done at the local level, and it has to be done with law enforcement because we're the people in authority and power that has to reach out to groups and number one, actually acknowledge the harms that policing has done in our society. It's done good, don't get me wrong, but it's also done a lot of bad. And to sit down and make public safety inclusive of all the stakeholders. Right now, public safety, we as citizens have abdicated our responsibility for inputting into public safety to the criminal justice system and to legislators and to the police. We as a community need to not be apathetic to what our role is in this, in creating community health and safety, because the person who suffers from a substance use disorder or the person who wants to consume marijuana as an adult should have the same input as the guy who owns the business or the cops or the courts into how public safety is defined in the community. I don't like to even use the term public safety anymore. I like to use the term community health and safety because it's inclusive of everybody. And right now it's not. And that's what the defund the police movement's about, is about making them inclusive into the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So if there's a police officer or maybe a community group and they're listening to this and they're thinking these guys are onto something, how can they get involved with Law Enforcement Action Partnership?
Sure, you can find us on the website, Google us, We are always recruiting peace officers, as we call them. Is I tend to view policing not as policing people. I think that's a very small piece of what we do. We should be peace officers serving our constituents. We come out, we speak with people, we do interviews. We're in the process of working with communities to implement local, state, and national recommendations on how to reimagine policing.
Thank you so much for joining us on the Tatiana Show. I'm sure that the audience learned a lot. I know that I did. Everybody, thank you, Lieutenant Diane Goldstein. Amazing work. Check out LEAP online, and we'll see you next time on the Tatiana Show.
Thank you, Tatiana. I really appreciate it.
The Tatiana Show has been brought to you by CryptoMediaHub.com, a boutique marketing and PR agency for Bitcoin and beyond. Hey there, it's time for the show, the Tatiana Show, where you make friends and talk life and crypto. We gotta think and reflect and use lots of intellect with our hearts when we work together. I know that it can be so hard out there, looking all around and saying that life ain't fair. So that is why we will fight and stay up late at night, listening to the Tatiana Show. Thank you for listening to the Tatiana Show. Please follow us on Twitter at Queen Tatiana or on Facebook and Instagram at Tatiana Moroz Music. More episodes can be found at thetatianashow.com, and make sure you leave a review on iTunes and tell your friends. You are listening to The Tatiana Show. This show may contain adult content, language, and humor and is intended for mature audiences. If that's not you, please stop listening. Nothing you hear on The Tatiana Show is intended as financial advice, legal advice, or really anything other than entertainment. Take everything you hear with a grain of salt. Oh, and if you're listening to us on an affiliate network, the ideas and views expressed on this show are not necessarily those of the network that you're listening on or of any sponsors or any affiliate products you may hear about on this show.